Our first reading is from Numbers. From Mount Or, the Israelites set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Odom. But the people became impatient on the way. The people spoke against God and against Moses. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord to take the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, "Make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live." So Moses made a serpent of bronze and put it upon a pole, and whenever a serpent bit someone, that person would look up at the serpent of bronze and live. The word of the Lord.
So, there's lots and lots of stories in the Bible that seem really weird and strange to us. But every once in a while, you come across a story that is weird and strange even to biblical scholars. And those people sometimes begin commenting on passages and they say, you wonder why this ever got written down and remembered. Because after all, writing down stuff on paper was expensive and it was time-consuming. And so if it was convenient to just forget a story and pretend it never happened, it would be easy to simply decide not to include it. And the story of God telling Moses to make a serpent of bronze and put it on a pole so that people could look at it and be healed from their snake bites is one of those stories. Even for the Bible, the bronze serpent story is a strange story to be remembered and written down because in the Bible, serpents always have a negative connotation. From the very beginning, the serpent is the agent of rebellion against God. And unlike in Greek mythology, serpents are never a symbol of healing, except in this story. This is a weird story to be written down and remembered because making a graven image is otherwise expressly prohibited by God. If you remember reading the lessons from last week, we had the 10 Commandments. Number 1, do not make a graven image. Do not set it up to be worshipped, and yet here God is breaking his own rule. It's weird. And this story is strange because as the centuries rolled on, the ancient Israelites did in fact begin to do exactly that. Most of us will remember the bronze serpent story from this thing in the wilderness, but you may not have read the story in 2 Kings where King Hezekiah has to take the thing and have it broken up because they put it in the temple and people were beginning to worship it. So the king says, we got to get rid of this thing, and eventually had to have it destroyed because that's what happened. So it's amazing that we didn't just pretend it, make it like it never happened. And in fact, Christians would probably never read this story in church if it were not for the fact that Jesus referenced this story in today's gospel reading. So what is it about this story? Why is it remembered in spite of its strangeness and in spite of the problems that it caused later on? And why was it so important that Jesus felt a need to bring it up? Well, maybe it's because for as strange and difficult as this story is, it helped people to remember in a very powerful way that God's help and healing were possible despite all the odds when people were willing to face what they were afraid of, to face the problems head on, to literally look at the snake, the very symbol of death. The first part of healing was to face head on the most difficult things in their lives, to acknowledge the challenges sometimes that they themselves had had a part in creating. And sometimes that meant even looking at the symbol of death. And Jesus brings that up when he references being lifted up on the cross. Sometimes we miss that because the cross is pretty. We make pretty things, on quilts and things like that. And we think of it as a nice, warm, cozy religious symbol. But it was not for the people who first heard this. This was like looking at the snake. This is a story Jesus brought up to remind us that health and healing and wholeness are possible when people trust God in the face of the things that they can't control. The ancient Israelites could not control the snakes. In fact, God doesn't take away the snakes. That's what they asked Moses to do. Pray to the Lord to take the snakes away. And God doesn't just magically make the snakes go away. He gives them a way through it. And looking at the bronze serpent as a cure for snake bite made no more sense to the ancient Israelites than it does to us. But when people were willing to trust God in spite of their skepticism, they got healed. And it was a lesson they needed to remember because the desert was going to continue to be full of snakes as well as other nasty stuff. I mean, the writer says, because they complained everything, God sent the snakes to bite them. But you know what? They were going to wander in the desert for another 40 years. And those deserts are all full of snakes. The snakes are not just there. When you go on one of these trips to the Holy Land, they will tell you sometimes if you're on a tour bus and you're out in the middle of nowhere they said, do not wander off into the desert because the desert's full of snakes, scorpions, and other bad stuff. That's just the way it is. So looking to God to help you through the midst of the snake is actually more important than praying, oh, please give me a desert that has no snakes in it, because that ain't going to happen. And this story is important because it reminds us to expect God to give people a future beyond their pain and their fear. Because after all, the people were looking towards the promised land. They were on a journey to somewhere, not simply looking forward to a day without snakes. And part of that meant trusting that their healing was not just for today. It was to empower them to keep looking forward and to keep moving towards the future that God had promised them. And I think Jesus mentioned this story because it illustrates what it means to follow God and to be faithful in any time and any place. Because we may not live in a wilderness that is literally surrounded by snakes, but life has a way of feeling like that sometimes. There are all kinds of snakes around us, and sometimes they bite. And honestly, if you're like me, or even like the ancient Israelites, your reaction is probably to ask God to take away the snakes so we don't have to deal with them anymore. I want to have no snakes in my life. But that doesn't always happen. And following Jesus in a world in which we're often surrounded by snakes means being willing to be people who face the things that scare us the most. Like the ancient Israelites, you cannot move forward in any journey of life by living in denial or simply waiting for the snakes to go away. And sometimes I get stuck, and maybe you do too, when I feel like I can't move forward until things look a little better out there. When the climate is better, when there's not so many snakes, when I feel like there is no danger to me to take a step forward. But faithful journeying often means being willing to face head-on the things that make me wonder, will this kill me emotionally or financially or even physically? Jesus' call to look on the cross is a call to face everything that scares us head-on, even death. Not because it's fun or even edifying, but because it's often only through facing those difficult challenges that Jesus brings us out of death into new life. That was the journey to the empty tomb. It went through the cross. And for us, often, bringing us to new life means bringing us through things that are really difficult and hard. Jesus mentions this story because he wants us to remember that following him in a world surrounded by snakes often means trusting God in the face of things we cannot control, even and especially when we don't have all the answers and when God's answers don't seem to make any intuitive sense. I often think that one of the problems we face as modern people is that we have been able to fix so many problems that our forebears faced. We can control things in our environment that our forebears could not. We can cure a lot of diseases that killed a lot of our ancestors easily. And so when we face something that we cannot fix, we wonder, well, what went wrong? We should be able to fix everything. And if not, who should be blamed? But there are just too many things in life that we cannot fix and we cannot change no matter how hard we try. And faithful journeying means being willing to continue on in the midst of the snakes and actually looking for God to help us deal with the snakes instead of just complaining to God, I want you to make the snakes all go away. One of the presenters at my ski continuing, because I did actually go to class when I was out skiing. One of our presenters was a professor of preaching at Princeton Seminary. She pointed out she is the preaching department because there's supposed to be 3 people on staff, and she's the only one there right now. And her doctoral dissertation and her area of expertise is preaching through trauma. And she said she got into this because when she was early on in her career, she was a pastor down in Virginia Beach, and it was during that time that the Sandy Hook shootings happened. And people in her congregation reacted as though it had happened personally to them. And she thought, what's going on here? This is terrible, but it didn't happen personally to them. And she started to talk to them some more about it, and she found out that a whole lot of them had been personally affected by the shootings at Virginia Tech. But they had never processed it. They had never talked about it. They had never dealt with it. And she said, part of not only psychologically, but theologically, the way to get through having to deal with snake bites is that you learn to live through it, to face it, to see God's help in the midst of that, and not just to pretend like it never happened. And she said, so much of our lives are geared towards, let's see if we can make it like it never happened. So I'm thinking about still, we're dealing with this youth center got all flooded out with the roof, and the ServPro came in, and ServPro's motto is, like it never happened. And so much of the way we want to deal with trauma in our lives is, I want it to be like it never happened. And that's just not the way it works in so much of our lives. There has to be a way through it and dealing with it. They had to look at the snake, and that was how they got through it. And she pointed out that there are stories like this in the Bible where God doesn't take the snakes away, but God helps people to get through it and to have new life in spite of it. And she says, this is even the thing with Jesus, right? Jesus brings us to new life, but he's still got the scars that happened on the cross. And this story is important because it reminds us to expect God to give us a future beyond the snake bites. Jesus called his first disciples not simply to expect a future in heaven after they had been bitten on earth, but also to be people who looked forward to the mission Jesus called them to be on after the resurrection. And spoiler alert, that journey also came with snake bites. Yet the snake bites wouldn't win in the end. People learned that, and they lived like that. And part of faithful journeying means seeing meaning and purpose in what God calls us to do right now, in spite of the snakes and in spite of sometimes getting bitten. So, this story of Moses and the bronze serpent, it is a strange one. But in fact, it reminds us of some fundamental truths about journeying with God and following Jesus. That's because the story reminds us that following Jesus always requires us to face head-on the things that scare us, and to trust God in spite of our pain, and to look forward to God's future. But even more than that, the story reminds us that God is always working in our lives to heal us and to give us hope. The story reminds us that God is always with us, even in the midst of things that scare us and bite us. And the story reminds us that God is always looking to give us a future and to lead us into that future, even when the present moment seems really scary.